Hello, everyone. It is that time of the week again for another Sirius report with London Paul. Very excited to, very honored to be joining with him today doing the interview. Unfortunately, V is still a little bit under the weather, so please keep him in your thoughts and prayers for a quick recovery. Also want to make sure to share our social media. Please visit roguemoney.net. Make sure you follow all of our social feeds, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, and then also Steemit. We're posting a lot of our articles and videos directly to Steemit. So very excited about that. And then also make sure you recommend our YouTube channel to friends, family, and ask them to subscribe as well. So Paul, how are you today, sir?
I'm very well, and good morning to you.
Good morning, Paul. A little bit before we went live, we started talking a little bit around the UK terrorist attack. And there's a lot of different narratives right now that are coming out from the MSM, from the alt news. So could you share a little bit around your thoughts regarding the UK terrorist attack, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious question is, and everyone immediately jumps on the rhetoric, oh, it's a cabal false flag attack. It's all the hallmarks of it. And I always go away and assess what's happened. Now, of course, having spent a lot of time in London, I know Westminster Bridge and around Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, very well, that whole area. Now, of course, what happened is this attacker, Khalid Massoudi, killed 4 pedestrians and injured about 50, because what he did is basically got in this car, drove on the pavement, mowed down a lot of pedestrians on Westminster Bridge. Then he crashed his car into the railings in front of the Parliament yard and then burst through the front gate to the Palace of Westminster, armed with knives. Obviously, very sadly, fatally stabbed an unarmed police officer, but moments later, of course, he was shot dead, and he would be by a close protection officer. And of course, at that point, obviously, Westminster went into lockdown. MPs had to stay in the House of Commons, and then the area was eventually cordoned off and declared safe. Now, when I look at that, people were saying, well, there's collaboration, in this attack with, MI5, or the UK intelligence services. Well, to be brutally honest, anybody, I or anyone else, can drive across Westminster Bridge in a car and commit this act. We can then ram into the railings. It's inevitable. If there's notices everywhere, if you walk, I've walked past that, along that bridge and past there countless times. I can't remember 100 times, whatever, in my life. And there's lots of notices warning people about security. If anyone breaks in there, particularly when they're armed, they're likely to get shot dead. And they were shot dead. It wasn't like the guy ran from the scene of the crime, which often happens, and then gets shot dead 2 days later in some strange kind of response to apparently who was actually responsible. Now, the thing that comes out is normally around the time, if there's some cabal false flag, there's a huge stoking in the media to get everyone into a state of frenzy, talking about the fact it's a terrorist attack. Now, the anti-terrorist police in the UK were very, very careful to say this guy was a lone man. He wasn't involved in anybody else. There's no reason to raise any further terror alert. They really downplayed it and kept it quiet. That's a very, very different kind of narrative than you normally hear when these kind of attacks happen, and false flag attacks do happen. Now, I'm not saying for certain it wasn't, but I think everyone just jumped to a conclusion. And I think the problem is, this is an example, and I've said this before, and it's a very small example, although killing anybody is hugely regrettable, and I'm not trivializing 4 people or 5 or whatever being killed and all the people being injured. But the truth is that in the grand scheme of what's happened, these are kind of these small scale attacks, and I've talked about global terrorism being a problem, and you will get random attacks, and they are just random attacks by lone wolves, as it were. And I see it far more as that, and I know plenty of people out there may disagree with me, but I don't see any evidence to support the view that this was some coordinated attack, because the whole response to it was very downbeat. They were trying to keep people calm about it. They weren't trying to rile and infuriate people and drive them into a frenzy, as often happens. There wasn't any calls for, well, we're going to have to massively up surveillance, and suddenly London's on a major attack alert and threat, and therefore we're going to have to act accordingly or do anything. They did the reverse, and that's why I see it maybe than other people do in that regard.
That's very valid points in terms of typically when these things happen, there's a narrative that they want to paint right away regarding afterwards, whether it's a legislation, something they're trying to pass. Now, he was a homegrown terrorist, correct? I mean, this wasn't a refugee that came to the country. He was a citizen, correct?
Yes, he was a citizen of the country. He turned to Islam. Yeah, he had a criminal record for a whole string of offences going back over a long period of time. There was talk at one time, apparently, that and this is maybe what fueled some people's perception, is that MI5 were assessing him at some point and then didn't regard him as a risk or a problem. But yeah, he's a homegrown guy, born here, lived here all his life. And so therefore, yeah, I mean, people say, well, okay, people get radicalized and do things. I mean, yes, that happens. But yeah, the whole thing for me doesn't fit the profile that you would normally associate with this. And, I could have gone straight away on the podcast and did a response, and I went away and thought about it and went, as I always do in these situations, what's really going on and what's the response? And of course, yeah, the alternative media is full of the conspiracy that it's part of some cabal false flag for some reason or other. And normally it's because they want to stoke up more anti-surveillance. Well, no disrespect, but London is gone. There's enough surveillance as it is. They really want to find people, and there is an argument they don't find people, but there's enough surveillance in London as a capital city is, and that area is full of it because it is the House of Parliament. And but the idea that there'd be some collusion with this individual and the security services in the UK, it just makes no sense. It's a statement of saying it, but if you look at it, as I say, it's not the area is restricted inside the Parliament yard in the House of Parliament, but anyone can drive in a car over Westminster Bridge, and you go and walk there any time of day, and there's cars flying backwards and forwards from 7 o'clock in the morning, and they're still going over at 9, 10 o'clock at night, although much reduced numbers. But during the day, there's a steady stream of vehicles going over there. So I don't think it was. I think it was just a lone wolf in this situation who, for whatever reason, decided to do what he did, and no one will know for definite what his rationale is. But it hasn't. It's gone very quiet. They're trying to downplay it. Obviously, there's a lot of upset amongst people as to what's happened for sure, but they're not trying to pull the narrative and scare the hell out of people and make them all go, oh, well, they're going to accept more draconian, measures for combating terrorism. There is a real threat. And of course, the obvious thing is, and I'm not linking this person to this situation, but as the terrorist threat diminishes in the Middle East, and certainly we're seeing it in Syria and obviously Iraq in principle, but also there's moves in Afghanistan to deal with it, you're going to see more and more of these sporadic attacks happening across the world. I mean, I read somewhere, it doesn't mean it's the case, but there was talk that the Islamic State's trying to recruit people in the Caribbean. Now, what is the move to try and go and carry out some attacks in the US, for example? I don't know. But it's this situation where when they start to become squashed in one part of the world, they're likely, and this has already happened, they're already trying to establish more toehold in Africa, for example. So this terrorist threat's not going to disappear overnight just because you get rid of the cabal and because you deal with the problem in the Middle East. It needs a global concerted effort, and this is what Putin said only in a couple of days ago. We need a sensible global perspective on this and how we deal with the problem, and it's something we're not seeing because, and he made the point, while we're dealing with the problem in the Middle East, the coalition is talking about what they're going to do and not actually doing anything, and that's a very valid point. And there is this whole idea that there's supposed to be a plan put in place by Trump, where he went away and said, right, I want a plan in how we deal with Daesh or the Islamic State. And at the moment, there's all this wrangling as to what that actually means and what they should do. I mean, yeah, terms, we want to deal with the problem, and what are you going to do about it? Where's your plan? And they can't even agree on a plan, which is a huge problem in itself, and hence why Putin's sitting there going, well, we'll just carry on doing what we're doing, and when you eventually decide what you want to do, well, fine. We'll sit down and talk with you about having a concerted plan, but we're not going to sit there waiting for you to make a decision.
Correct. Now, Paul, in your mind, in terms of, because you're exactly right regarding the media, there's so many different reports that come out, what to believe and what not to believe. And we're kind of seeing that a little bit also in the Middle East, in particular with Syria, in terms of the Trump administration. There's some people that are leveraging, and they want to paint the narrative that Trump is escalating things even more. He's putting more troops on the ground, more boots on the ground. What are your thoughts on this? Is this a concentrated effort with the Russians? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, certainly in Syria, yes, that seems to be the impression. I mean, there's a lot playing this down, say, well, Russia and America aren't really coordinated. They very much are coordinated. I mean, they had the meeting with the Turks as well, where they all sat down and had a proper briefing as to how they could coordinate things, particularly in terms of airspace, in terms of coordinates provided to pinpoint attacks. So very, very much so they are doing. I mean, that's the private rhetoric. Publicly, it's all trying to, because there's still this whole fear of, if we associate with Russia, then we're just going to create more problems back home. So we have to kind of notionally pretend that Russia's still a big bad ogre, and we don't really want to deal with it. But privately we are dealing with it. But the problem is, it's difficult with the US. I mean, we talked about this before we came on air, where suddenly we've had this situation where in Yemen, where the US said, well, okay, we're going to go in and have some pinpoint attacks in handling Al Qaeda. And now James Mattis has asked the White House to remove restrictions on US military support for Saudi Arabia and its allies engaged in a military offensive against Yemen. Well, that doesn't kind of stick in with what Trump's ideology is. That's a kind of potential escalation. Now, we'll have to see, obviously, what happens, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be allowed, but there's also talk of them helping the UAE take the key Red Sea port of, forgive my pronunciation, I think it's Hodeidah, something like that.
Right.
So,
correct.
So there's all this kind of rhetoric that's coming out, and this is going to have to be debated in the next week or two as to what happens. And it doesn't recommend that the kind of White House agrees with the plans that the UAE have got in that regard. But there is a lot of confusion, and some of the confusion is because people are automatically associating, well, if the US get it, put more boots on the ground, they're just trying to escalate something. Well, no, not at all. If they do things in a coordinated and a concerted manner that deals with the problem, which of course the old administration never attempted to do, then in that regard, that's fine. But if they start to escalate things, then that's going to be a major problem. Now, there are certainly elements within the administration, whoever they may be, who are still itching to try and stoke up tensions with Iran. But it's an utterly futile gesture, and it's ridiculous. And we have seen a huge climb down with regards to Iran, but you'd arguably say, well, what are they getting involved in Yemen for? Well, partly because the Yemenis are really pushing the Saudis back. Saudis bankrupt, as we said, they're in big trouble. And the notion of supporting the Saudis is a really, really ridiculous move if they intend to escalate the conflict. And if they think in a way it's going to drag Iran into it and stoke up those kind of fires, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I've said before, if the Trump administration does stupid thing, I'm going to be the first person to, from my perspective, to say this is absolutely ridiculous. And if they do stoke it, then that is ridiculous. So we have to assess things on an individual basis from nation to nation. But personally, thus far, apart from the suggestion coming out to do with Saudi and Yemen, I haven't seen anything that particularly concerns me. Although, we had a situation in Iraq where only the other day, where there was this whole kind of problem of the US or the coalition bombing civilian targets. Now, apparently there was about 200 civilians killed in a bombing carried out by coalition forces on Daesh positions. Now, the issue was, well, was it to do with airstrikes even, or did the Iraqi ground forces strike it? By all accounts, what Daesh is doing it, they're actually targeting civilian areas to give the impression that they've got some stronghold there. Obviously, there was erroneous coordinates given, and by all accounts, the US is having a proper investigation and probe into how it happened. They're saying it was carried out at the request of the Iraqi security forces, who sort of ergo, therefore, they were responsible for providing the coordinate. Now, in the past, this would have all got whitewashed. Now there's proper investigations, and apparently Germany's also called for an investigation as to why this incident's happened. But there are dirty tricks. Goes without saying, Daesh and the Islamic State are going to use dirty tricks to try and provoke a reaction. Because, of course, the thing is, if they accidentally kill civilians, they feel it will demoralize the people, and in some way it might turn favor towards them. Although, obviously, they're very much a diminished force now in Iraq. So there are all these problems, but I'm seeing encouraging signs that the US is taking it seriously and going, okay, there's a major problem. How did this happen? What are we going to do to avoid this in the future? Where in the past, it was either lip service or it was completely whitewashed and smokescreen, and nothing was said about it. So there are encouraging signs in a lot of ways, but on the flip side, there are also problems that we need to keep an eye on, and we'll assess. And if we feel that we strongly disagree with it, then I will publicly say so, most definitely.
Sure, because when you think of that, Trump, whenever he was campaigning, he specifically talked about, concentrated efforts, destroying ISIS, partnering with the Russians, getting this accomplished. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion in regards to the relationship with the Saudis. And then here recently, you saw where Trump went ahead and authorized a fairly large weapon sale to the Saudis that was previously blocked by Obama. So is that Mattis influence, do you think, to Trump to authorize that, to continue the escalation in Yemen?
It's very, I mean, yeah, it's possible, but also the other problem you have is, and it's a bit of a difficult kind of major geopolitical hot potato, is with Saudi. I mean, nobody likes the House of Saud and the Saudi regime, but the question is, the Saudi regime is very weak now. Internally, it has huge problems. It is bankrupt. I mean, yeah, there's all these nations investing in there, but China investing to take a stranglehold in terms of making sure Saudi behaves itself, and that's not something obviously everyone's aware of. But the issue is, the House of Saud collapses, it creates this huge vacuum. Who's going to fill the vacuum in Saudi? So sometimes, as much as you might not be happy to have a particular regime in charge in, say, for example, Saudi being an example, the flip side is, well, if the regime collapses, what happens? It could be 100 times worse. Now, that doesn't mean everyone wants the House of Saud to stay the way it is for the next 50, 100, whatever years, or 10 years, 5 years, it doesn't matter. But on the flip side, you've got to be very careful, because there is a lot of political instability, obviously, in the Middle East now. If the House of Saud collapses, does something like Daesh or ISIS fill the gap? And what does that mean? I mean, so it is a huge problem. So on the one side, saying we'll provide arms contracts might be to allow Saudi to defend itself. Purely for that reason, it's not exactly straightforward as to why, just because someone's given arms, it's automatically going to be used to attack Yemen. It might not be, and there may be small print that says no, that's not what the purpose is, and we're not. But of course, that might not be the case. So we have to be very careful how we assess why nations are being supported the way they are. Because sometimes it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. So.
Sure. So in your opinion, in terms of the Saudis and the escalation on Yemen, is it about the natural resources? Is it about the ports? How can our listeners, what's the best way to explain that conflict?
Well, obviously, yes, strategically, if you look at Yemen in terms of the Gulf, it's kind of very important. Yeah, it could be resource based in terms of oil. And also, it could just be purely because this is seen as a proxy war, or has been, between the US and Iran, effectively. And of course, there is this ideology that's gone along for years that Iran's, going to launch some nuclear war. It's a real serious terrorist threat in the Middle East, and therefore that can be the reason as well, is that they're trying to drag Iran into a bigger conflict and hope that they slip up in the Middle East. There's a lot of possibilities in terms of the geopolitics of it, but in terms of what they're actually going to achieve, I mean, ultimately, for me, Yemen will be Saudi's Vietnam. It's not going to succeed, and this is why the US would be absolutely ridiculous to get involved in a conflict like that. I mean, if they haven't learned the lesson from what went on ever since Vietnam in practically every war, you can't win these wars. That's why nations like Russia and China don't get involved. Yeah, Russia's gone involved to sort the problem out, but that's in a kind of way of dealing with the problem. They're not there to stoke a problem and create it to overthrow a regime. And it will ultimately drag Saudi more and more into the mire. Saudi can ill afford this, but of course, a lot of the time nations go to war with other nations when at home they're very, very weak. So because then they think people will perceive it as being a position of strength, that they're going to fight a war. But ultimately it's futile, and it will probably end up just being a Vietnam for them. And the US gets dragged into that. It's ridiculous, because it's exactly what Trump said he doesn't want to do. He wants to scale back US international intervention and in terms of NATO, etc. And of course, that's an interesting thing. And I'd heard a rumor, but we're now hearing that when he met Merkel, he gave her a bill for $375 billion of NATO payments.
Yeah. Tell us about that. That's something that went missed for most of the media.
Well, obviously, we talked about this previously, where Trump and Merkel met, and my God, the air between them was very tense, to put it mildly. Now, he reportedly told Merkel that you owe us hundreds of billions of dollars to NATO because you haven't been paying, and the Germans were absolutely furious, saying this is outrageous. You can't do that. But he handed the bill apparently to Merkel during the meeting when she was in Washington D.C. and of course the Germans have reacted, going, they're just trying to intimidate us, and we're not going to fall for it. But he makes the point, and it is correct, that these nations like Germany just don't pay anywhere near what they should in terms of NATO. And he's rightly saying, well, why should the US shoulder the burden of it, which they have done? It's about time other nations paid up. But that would probably explain also why the air was so frosty between them. I mean, she probably thought it was a joke at first, but he's deadly serious that nations should pay up, and he's absolutely right in that regard. Why should the US shoulder the burden of it?
Correct. Yeah, and getting back a little bit to the Middle East and the sandbox, I want to talk specifically around Israel and Syria. There's been a lot of rhetoric raised recently with, the Israel bombing Syria potentially threatening Israel as well. Help me understand that conflict. What's going on there?
Well, obviously, yes, Israel invaded the Syrian airspace. So then there was an altercation, and they're saying they shot down one Israeli aircraft and damaged another one. Of course, Israel denied it, and then they admitted it, saying they were trying to tackle Hezbollah. And then the Russian ambassador got involved, and they gave the Israelis a real ticking off. And then, of course, Israel said, well, we reserve the right to go back in if we want to. And now, the last couple of days, where Syria's gone, well, actually, if you do, we'll use Scud missiles against you. So it's getting very hot-headed. I don't think in reality that's just all words. Yes, the risk is that Israel may go back in, and they say we're attacking justifiable targets. Well, maybe from their perspective they are, but Russia's put them on notice that we're going to see what you actually do rather than just words necessarily. I think it's a kind of, it might just all blow over and that'll go quiet. But certainly Russia is now fully supportive of Syria, as we know, and I've said this before, and it's absolutely the case that Netanyahu on a leash, so to speak, and that's absolutely true. It doesn't mean that there is a risk that something could kick off in the Middle East. I mean, we can't happen, but I think it's highly unlikely. But of course, people do get kind of rather worried about it because it all sounds very hot-headed. There's all this rhetoric flying around. Likely. I mean, of course, the risk is if Israel do go into Syrian airspace and carry out some mission, again, what's going to be the Syrian response? I think more importantly, what's going to be Russia's response to Israel? That's the reality of it. And Netanyahu, who's got his own problems internally with his nation, he's very disliked. There's a lot of cases where I'm not saying he's going to be prosecuted, but there's investigations as to the conduct of the government and whatever. So he's far from in a strong position. And Kim always says, and I come back to it, when somebody behaves and starts to throw their weight around another nation, because politically at home they're very weak, and I think that's part of the reason with Netanyahu. But he's got a formidable adversary in Russia, and also he needs Russian support, ironically. So I think whatever was actually said by the ambassador, we can't be certain, but I imagine it was pretty harsh. And essentially Israel were told to cut it out, and it was not to happen ever again. If they do,
Sure.
well, time will tell what the response will be.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the amount of conflicts, the amount of things that are happening geopolitically, and it's happening all at once. And although, and I'm very optimistic regarding the U.S. foreign policy, some things changing, but then also there's some warning signs that are there, Paul. So what to you are some of the quote unquote, or what I would like to say, like non-negotiables? What would lead you to believe that, hey, the U.S. foreign policy is clearly not going in the right direction, things got to change drastically? And I'm like you, we'll be the first to call those things out. But have you kind of played those out a little bit in terms of the next steps in the Middle East and what you foresee happening?
Well, obviously, where they would step out of line immediately is if, in terms of Syria, they started to act unilaterally and not in cooperation, and started to put extensive forces on the ground, doing something ironically they, even under the Obama administration, they didn't do. So, I mean, that would be a clear example, because I just don't see that happening. The same could be argued about what's going on in Iraq. So the ultimate thing is, if they really stoke tensions up with Iran, now, as much as it's absolute folly and stupidity, that would be a real serious concern for me if they started doing that. And I've publicly said it before, it would be insanity, and I would rebuke the Trump administration if they did it, because it would be absolute folly and stupidity. And they don't need to be dragged into someone else's problem. At the moment, Israel's very isolated, and they're not in any position, if they have US support, to start, you know, upping the ante with Iran. It would be a very foolish thing for them to do, and absolutely. So really, that for me is the ultimate problem that would start to raise serious alarm bells. I don't think, yeah, the Yemen situation could be, but I don't see that escalating into the same extent as something like Iran. Probably, if it ever got to that point, it would. So yeah, that really would be the major alarm bell situation for me in terms of the Middle East currently, of course. But I mean, the whole Middle East is very unstable. A lot of nations are creaking very badly economically. So it is. It's always been a sort of powder keg in the sense. But of course, what's going on in Syria has calmed a lot of that down. What's going on in Iraq's calmed a lot of that down. And we're seeing the growing influence of Russia and China, for that matter, both in terms of Afghanistan as well. And it's a kind of two-pronged attack in terms of economics from the Chinese, but some military cooperation with the Chinese as well. But there, it's part of extending the One Belt, One Road right the way through the Middle East as well, and through obviously Afghanistan and nations in that, and obviously the old Soviet Asian republics too. So, and of course, Russia has the military stance, but also there's a lot of economic cooperation. They've done a huge amount with Egypt, for example. They're obviously starting to do more and more with Syria, although Syria is obviously in a huge transitional phase because it's still at war, although it's not obviously as bad as it was in the last 4 or 5 years. So, but that's the big geopolitical change. Now the question is, from Trump's perspective, does he really want to carry this on and just cause, repeat all the problems that US administrations have done for years, or does he do what he really wants to do? Now, we know that the problem he has currently within his administration is he's not popular with a lot of his own Republicans. He's despised by the Democrats. So he has huge problems, and he's having to cherry pick his way around the world in terms of how he does things. And he's starting to learn, this job's a lot harder than even he realized. He knew he was really stepping into a more landmines than you and I could care to imagine, but he's realizing it's even harder. Because, and this goes back to the point why removing the cabal, yes, it's happening, and it's happening quickly in a lot of ways, but it's a long, drawn-out process, and you can't just eliminate them overnight, because it is that complicated and that convoluted. And the security services is another example of it, and we've seen, I mean, there's more and more revelations happening by the day in terms of what the FBI are doing and the problems he's got internally with the intelligence services. And ultimately, the problem for me is with the CIA. I mean, they do control everything as far as I'm concerned. And people may disagree, but I've seen enough evidence in recent years to support that viewpoint. So he has huge internal problems, but those internal problems spill out into foreign policy as well, as we know, in terms of what the CIA has done for decades in terms of foreign policy.
Yeah, I completely agree in terms of Iran. And I specifically remember, was it back in 2011, 2012 with, General Wesley Clark, and, he had revealed regards to the 7 countries in 5 years, and Iran being the final, the final step, the final war. But Iran's been, recently, pivoting a lot towards China and Russia, and really brokering some deals in Syria, partnering with Iraq. I mean, they've gained a lot of influence in the Middle East, correct?
They will, and of course, this is part of the rise of Persia again, as I refer to it, is going to be immense in future. And of course, when that happens, there's going to be casualties in the Middle Eastern nations as a result of it, as they get economically stronger. But sure, they are. I mean, They have a lot of military cooperation with Russia. China wants to see them part of the One Belt, One Road, clearly. So there's huge economic advantage for them. So they've got a lot of support, and they are starting, as you say, they're working with the Iraqis too. I mean, the West pitched them against each other and tried to have them warring as we had the Iran-Iraq war. So those kind of changes are happening. So this is another reason probably why Netanyahu's frightened, because he sees the rise of Iran as a strong nation again. And it is, I mean, culturally, it dates back thousands of years. It's rather like the Chinese. It has a huge, strong tradition. Yes, it's got huge problems like any other nation's got, but it's in the process of transitioning. But it's a very underestimated nation. It has a very educated nation. It's very strong in terms of its belief in its population being educated. But yes, it has problems, and it needs to change. But it's come out from the cold. And this is the irony: is, you know, if you look at the Obama administration, the nuclear deal really was kind of just propelled Iran into a completely different nation as to what it was prior to the sanctions. And now, of course, they're flooding the market with very cheap oil. And I've noticed today the oil price is starting to gradually kind of slump again. It's down, heading towards $47 a barrel. So they do have huge economic sway in the world again, and they're only going to likely to get stronger, which is going to be, of course, then put a lot of fear in nations. But Iran, from my perspective, doesn't have any ideology to want to start waging war on other nations. And what it's actually done in terms of Syria and Iraq has been very supportive in crushing whoever else it might be. And contrary to this view that it's the nation that harbors the most terrorism on the planet, I just don't see that. I'm sorry. If someone could prove to me to the contrary, fine, but I don't see that to be the situation at all.
Right, right. You know, my theory was that the Obama administration gave Iran that deal in hopes of giving them enough rope to hang themselves. In other words, you know, allowing them to go going through the inspections in regards to the development of plutonium and their nuclear weapons. That it was done on purpose to, again, this is just my theory, that they wanted that to happen to give them more reasons for them to go ahead and escalate things there in Iran, you know, as far as more of a military operation.
Well, that's very possible. I mean, during the Bush administration, they put a load of bombs on the Iranian side of the border and basically said, well, you know, you can use them against Iraq, and the Iranians went, you must be joking. So there's been definite attempts in years gone by to try and stoke up the Iranians to get involved in a conflict, but they're far too intelligent to get involved in that kind of debacle where they're actually seen to be responsible with direct military action and in terms of the Middle East, because we all know if they started launching some offensive, unfortunately, it's going to escalate into a major problem there. And they have no desire to do that for obvious reasons. What would be the point? Ultimately, it would be their own destruction. So it would be insanity to do that.
Correct. And Paul, you mentioned earlier in regards to the administration and the amount of, it seems like there's some chaos going on right now. Who to trust? You know, Paul Ryan, you know, fails to deliver on a healthcare bill. You know, so he's kind of throwing basically I'm not sure if you saw it the other day, but basically Trump sent out a tweet saying to make sure to watch Judge Janine. She does a Fox show, and basically the first 2 minutes of her show, She states that it's time for Paul Ryan that he's ineffective and it's time for him to resign. So what's your insights of what do you think is happening with the administration currently?
Well, yeah, in terms of the healthcare bill, people said it's a disaster, and ultimately it's a complete failure for Trump. I mean, it causes problems in terms of his tax reforms for sure, but if you look at it purely in the context of that, he isn't going to lose. He isn't the one who's going to shoulder the responsibility. And we've already seen Chuck Schumer going, oh, well, maybe if Trump slightly modifies his view, we can start to have discussions about some healthcare bill. The problem is we all know Obamacare is going to blow up in everybody's face. And people will just remember, well, Trump actually tried to do something about this, and it got balked, and obviously they didn't have the vote, and it failed. And he's probably right, and nothing will probably happen now until Obamacare implodes, and everyone will rush around the table and go, okay, what are we going to do? And ultimately, he'll probably more or less get through what he wanted to, but in the process, yes, there are people who've been damaged by this. I don't think Trump's been damaged by it, and he's positioned it very carefully. And who knows, it's difficult to assess within his administration who he can't. But I think repeatedly, when these bills come out, he's starting to learn who he can trust and who he can't. And we talked about this briefly before we came on air, that he's supposed to be creating this new position for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now, obviously, there's this newly formed White House Office of American Innovation that's going to leverage business ideas, maybe privatize some government functions, for example. So he might work in the areas of veterans care, there's opiate addiction, technology, data infrastructure, etc. Now, of course, the question immediately everyone's going to say is, well, I'm not very happy about this. This is Kushner, it's nepotism. No, the reality is Trump's put him in for a number of reasons. One, whatever people may think of him, he's a very smart guy and he's very, very capable, Kushner. Two, he knows he can trust him 100% in terms of the nepotism. If Kushner doesn't do his job, he'll get fired. It's like he said to his son, you screw up my businesses when I'm president, I'll fire you. And they most certainly will be removed. There's no kind of soft options and cushy jobs even for Trump's, son-in-law. So, I mean, that is hugely significant and is indicative. I think this role sounds kind of interesting. It's a way of taking part of this wrecking ball, as I've said before, in terms of what needs to be changed within the US. And it's a massive job. I mean, healthcare is one example. But I unearthed actually some interesting statistic to do with the US economy. I mean, apart from there are literally hundreds of statistics to do with the US economy that show that it has huge problems. But if you look in terms of taxation and where all the money is spent, I mean, largely most of it's spent on Social Security, Medicare, there's mandatory spending, defense, and interest on the money, which is ridiculous. Now, we're kind of at this crunch point now in terms of if there's suddenly a financial recession, even though there has been a recession, but a fully fledged major meltdown, kind of 2008 style, there's going to be massive deficits in terms of the US economy. Enormous. Now, people say, well, actually, he's going to spend extra money on defense, and there's a valid point there. But if you look in terms of where they can make financial savings and reduce the amount of money that has to be spent in relation to tax revenue, that's something that needs to be assessed. So you have to take a wrecking ball approach to how that's dealt with. And it's not unique to the US by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a massive, massive problem that needs to be addressed. And of course, we always come back to this point. At that time, somebody stood up and said, we're not paying interest on this debt anymore. We don't need to do that. We can issue our own interest-free currency and don't have to pay any debt on it. Simple as that. And any nation's allowed to do that. That if you really want to send a kind of hand grenade through the economic landscape, just say that, because nations can rightly do that. And it's not a question of creating inflation as a result of it. If it's done in a proper coordinated manner, it won't create inflation. But the reality is, real inflation starting to seep into Main Street. And if you look at the real economic statistic, inflation's not about 2.5%, 2.3, whatever it is. Inflation in the US, for example, is probably at least 6.5%. And I know just living in the UK, if I go shopping, I'm seeing prices in terms of groceries going up 5%, 10%. I mean, my mobile phone provider, in the whole history, I've had an account with them for 12 years. You sign a contract, you pay a monthly sum of money. They're now saying we're going to actually raise your monthly rental by 3% or 3.5%. Supposed to be in line with inflation. I've never seen that in my life. Well, that's hugely indicative of the kind of problems we're experiencing in terms of inflation. And we've talked before, we said about shrinkflation, where products are getting smaller and they're charging the same price. So inflation's a huge, huge problem, and that's something that is going to have to be addressed also in terms of how you manage your budget and manage your finances. And that's a huge problem that Trump's got to have. And of course, the interesting thing as well is the debt ceiling. It's all gone incredibly quiet. No one's talking about it.
Correct. And
I mean, what's the situation?
No, I was just going to specifically state, just in regards to Trump removing the tax penalty for those that did not purchase insurance, that was budgeted in, for the Medicaid, the Medicare expansion. And so now that money is no longer going to be there, and that's going to even increase the deficit. And you're completely right in regards to the social services, Social Security, Medicaid. The government expenditures on that is just massive.
Oh yeah, if you look at the profile in recent years, if you go back to say 2000 as an example, and you look at kind of the tax revenue and obviously the amount of expenditure, the tax revenue comfortably paid for net interest, defense, mandatory spending, Medicare, and Social Security. And you see how kind of even just prior, probably it started not so much growing exponentially, but it started increasing through 2005. It spiked around the 2010 or 2009 when economically so you had this huge deficit. It sort of has started to recover slightly, and the spending plateaued a little bit from around 2009 to 2012, 13. So, and now it was starting to hike up again in the latter stage. Well, no doubt, of course, that's what the Obama administration would do because it's trying to win votes. So, but yeah, of course, there's going to be a sharp fall in tax revenue when we have the projected, economic recession in inverted commas, or far worse than that. So it is a massive problem. And again, it's becoming the crunch time from a Trump perspective. How quickly are people going to start blaming him for what's going on instead of the absolute mess we know he's inherited? It's a very fine juggling act, but it's something he needs to be aware of and the debt ceiling is a great example. What are they going to do? Normally the media will be foaming at the mouth about this every day of the week and stoking up people's fear. And people might say, oh, well, we're seeing some hangover from that because the markets are starting to fall. Well, yeah, the Dow's fallen and the S&P fall. It's not what I call serious territory. I'm not that personally concerned at this point in terms of what it means in an economic sense. It's dropped a little bit. If it continues to drop, and it gets 20,000, 15,000, then we're starting to talk about something serious. But at the moment, I don't see it being, particularly a serious matter. So we're not really seeing the kind of reaction that we've had in the past to do with the whole debt ceiling and fiasco, and it's kind of the grand theatre of it. It is the silence is quite deafening. So what is actually going on? Is anything being done about it? We're not hearing any Democrats talking about it. Republicans. It's very puzzling at this stage why nothing's being said.
Yeah, so true. And now, so you have in jeopardy any type of, tax cuts, and there's so much information, disinformation, different information coming out from the administration. You have, oh, we're going to work on tax cuts next. You have Reince Priebus that stated that basically that no, the wall tax is still a go. We're gonna pass a tax to pay for the wall. So much just information is coming out, and in particular with Jared Kushner, and seeing him appointed to this office and doing this. And then also we're seeing, Trump's daughters get heavily involved as well. Trump, it's tough for him to decide who he can trust and who he can't. And what's the timeline that you see as far as, is it the next 3 to 6 months? He's got to move quickly on some of these agenda items. And it was my biggest fear when they started focusing on healthcare from the start, was that it was going to boggle things down. It was going to slow things down. So are they going to move forward with these tax cuts? What do you think are the next steps in terms of the administration and how they move forward?
Well, your time frame is absolutely right. I think 3 to 6 months is quite critical. I think for me, more importantly, perhaps, is because at the moment we're getting these little bit pieces. Well, there's talk about a tax cut here. We're going to spend some money here. We need to see an overall budget plan that says, okay, we're raising this much tax revenue. This is how we're going to spend it. This is where we're going to shave off some of the saving. This is where we're going to have to spend additional money. And how does that kind of play into the whole debt ceiling as well in the process? Now, that's the critical question. At the moment, we're not seeing that now. The important thing for any administration is to actually have a budget that they can stick to and is actually realistic and possible to achieve, not some grandstanding headline making, well, we're going to cut taxes here. And yeah, it's great, cut taxes, but how are you going to pay for cutting taxes? And people all say, well, in the new world, we're not going to have taxes. And well, no, I'm sorry, the world's not going to be like that for the foreseeable future. You're going to have to accept the fact things are going to have to be paid for. And if we say we're not going to have taxes, how are we going to pay for any of these services? How do we, in the UK is a great example. Okay, we have a welfare state that we don't pay healthcare costs. Obviously, healthcare is free, but we have an aging population. How are we going to finance looking after our retired senior citizens in the nation? I mean, these are examples. How is this paid for? It's not going to magically suddenly not be paid for. But for a start, for me, the obvious one is stop paying interest on money. It's a huge, it's enormous what it is in the UK. It's an enormous slice of the budget in terms of the US. You can just stop doing that. That's very controversial, and you can't do it overnight. But there's no doubt Trump knows about this. He's fully aware how the financial system has raped and pillaged nations across the world, and knows that it needs to be changed. But you can't turn that huge oil tank around overnight. But your projection, yeah, he's got to start to have some concrete plans. And at some point, he's got to be careful that people don't go, well, actually, you're responsible. You caused, the financial crash of 2000 or whatever it might be, 17, 18 or whatever, who knows when specifically something's going to happen. He's got to be very careful. He's not held accountable when in fact we full well know it's got absolutely nothing to do with it.
Correct. And yeah, there's the time's a little bit limited as far as, here they're getting ready to come up on, I was looking at the Congress recess break. Okay. It's ridiculous how many days that they get off, Paul, and they want to call this work. They're going to be on recess from April the 10th through the 21st. So you're literally talking any legislation, any type of, debt ceiling talk has to occur between now and the 10th of April.
Yeah, and we're not here. I just don't think it's going to happen. There's an argument they can kind of scramble through until June, and I think that's probably true. But it's at some point, people are going to start getting nervous. The jitters are going to happen, and it's going to have an effect. Now, you and I know the stock market's irrelevant, and who cares? I don't care whether whatever it might be 20,000, 50,000, or 5,000. It really is irrelevant to me. I'm just more interested in economic realities, and we're seeing, and it's the same in the UK. We've got huge economic problems. They're burying it very carefully and very cleverly. But when you scratch below the surface and you see what's happening for businesses across the UK, they're suffering. We have problems with retail as well as you do in the US. So it's a monumental problem that they can't just kick the can down the road and not make a decision. But the question is, what does Trump do if he raises the debt ceiling? Well, okay, that's fine. But if he doesn't, what's the repercussions? It's going to get hair raising when the government starts going, well, actually, we're going to have to put a freeze on spending in X, Y, and Z areas. It's not to garner much popularity amongst the people. And I do think to some extent he's turned the oil tank around in terms of the support he has amongst the people. I think that the vitriol is worn off a bit. We're not seeing the kind of problems we had, in the week, after his inauguration. So, but that doesn't mean obviously everyone supports it, but I think more people are more sympathetic. But his economic policy now is, well, what does he do with tax reform? It's very, very difficult, and we have to see a proper budget, and we're not seeing it. So, I think we can speculate and say in a broad sense what we'd like to see, but I think we have to see the actual budget and then say, well, actually, this is what he's trying to do. Okay, that makes economic viable sense. If it doesn't and it's complete rubbish, then he's got a huge problem because his credibility would then be shot to bits. But it's a very difficult job because he's absolutely right. The US economy and the UK and anywhere else is a mess, is being polite. It's absolutely catastrophic what the state of it, no matter what the stock market says or anyone else. And we're seeing again another kind of, whether it's a false dawn, and we talked about the gold and silver markets, they're clearly starting to rise again and have
gold, shut up today, correct?
Yeah, you've got as high as 1260. It's kind of went back a bit, it's about 1255. Silver's gone over $18 an ounce. There's a definite movement, and I can tell you quite an interesting story regarding gold, the gold market. Now,
please.
In terms of, for the first time I've seen in terms of for sale, there are Rothschild 100-gram gold bars suddenly appeared for sale. Now, these are very, very old, because you've got to put it in the context that the Rothschilds stopped refining metals in the mid-60s. Now, so the question is, it's kind of, for want of a better word, deep storage gold of these small denominations is suddenly rearing its head and is for sale. Now, I'm not saying the Rothschilds have offloaded all this and selling all gold and whatever, but it's interesting how suddenly these 100-gram gold bars have appeared in the market, and if you go and Google it, you'll find them. You can buy them. So I think it's just another attempt. They're just trying to dig out any gold they can to try and prop it up, because the amount of gold, physical gold buying, and silver for that matter, is accelerating and rocketing by the week and month, and not just in the obvious places like Russia, China. I think you're starting to see it hike up again. And we had a situation in the UK after Brexit where people were queuing around the corner to go into their local bullion dealers to buy gold and silver. And I've never seen that.
Wow. From
my memory. So, and we're kind of seeing that position where there is a move back into it. There was a lot of idea, gold's going to get smashed down below $1,000 an ounce, and it was never viable. It's never realistic. And we talked, recently about the fact of this seismic change in the gold and silver markets, and I see that is absolutely happening. And interestingly as well, I did some analysis of stats from the COMEX. Now, obviously, there's ratios between, paper gold and physical gold, and you can, without boring people with the technicalities, you can go away and analyze the data and come to the ratio. Now, the ratio for a while's been kind of 25 to 1, so there's 25 ounces of paper gold to actual physical gold. And now it's going up. It's about 35 to 1 now. Now, I'm going to keep close eye on that. I know it's spiked before, and we had a situation where it went ridiculously high, but I'm going to keep an eye on, because I'm intrigued to see if that continues to spike. And are we going to see any more situations where there's going to be a massive paper dump in the market to try and suppress the price? We haven't seen that for the last couple of weeks. It remains to be seen. They may try it again. But this squeeze is happening. And the fact this Rothschild gold's turned up in the market, I think, is hugely indicative of a desperation to dig out any gold they can in the hope of trying to satisfy the demand and to try and stop the paper market blowing up in the process.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's only so long the Fed can keep, pushing the manipulation that's, been occurring forever. And their move to raise interest rates did nothing. There was no economic data to support, them doing that. And again, one could argue and say, well, you know what, the in terms of the rates, they were kept down for a reason, on purpose. But we're seeing so much occur globally right now. Look at we covered it last week in regards to Russia, and removing putting in place their new SWIFT program, putting in place, getting away from Visa, MasterCard, all those transactions. So things are escalating pretty quickly in terms of geopolitically, in terms of monetary policy, and understanding that the dollar can't last forever.
Oh no, and they've got systems in place. They can bring them on. I mean, they're all fully tested. They can bring things online by just switching it on, and it's live. Far advanced they are. They're well prepared for what's coming, and this is why, if you go to China and even Russia, they're encouraging their people to buy precious metals.
Yes.
And you don't see that in the West. They're almost trying to persuade people to ditch them and buy stocks. Yeah, let's all buy stocks. I mean, pretty soon we're going to hear analysts go, "Oh, now's the time to buy stocks." We've had, they've fallen 500, 600, 800 points. It's time to pile back in. It's just a small correction for the next blip upwards. They'll be talking that narrative. Yeah, I mean, we're increasingly seeing, obviously, gold and silver devotees telling people to go and buy gold and silver. But there's the Russian stats came out recently. I mean, I think they said they do acquire another 9 tons of gold in February. It's probably an awful lot more than that. They are buying every ounce of precious metals they can get their hands on. So are the Chinese, because they know precisely what's coming, and it's going to be the bedrock of the financial system, and why they've been doing it for years on end.
Absolutely. Paul, we've come to the end of a show. It's been very informative. Please send your information out, how people can learn more about your work, follow you as well. So please.
Well, first off, thank you very much. I've really, as ever, always enjoyed doing the show every week. We could talk for weeks, and some people who know me very well know that I talk incessantly about this if someone wants to listen. But in terms of, we obviously have the website, the Sirius Report. That's SIRIUS. That's largely just our website. We put a lot of free stuff on there. We do some daily kind of news updates with little bits of information that we think are interesting for people to go away and read and research themselves, as well as obviously we have our premium content, which, thanks to you at Rogue Money, we've had a lot of people subscribing. We've had people saying, I've subscribed to you because I caught it with you via Rogue Money and doing the shows with me. And that is 5 podcasts a week. We do all the latest updates. It's an in-depth analysis of what's going on in terms of geopolitics and finance. It's very global perspective. Yeah, we talk about the US quite a bit, but we talk about a lot of other nations too. It's very hard to condense it because they're 10 to 15 minutes a day. So it's getting quite hard now to find the information and what to talk about and what not to talk about. And sometimes you kind of feel I'm having to not put information in there because obviously we do set that sort of time limit. It costs $4.75 a month. We think it's great value, and we get a lot of huge positive feedback. And we thank all our subscribers, and we've obviously got the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, which we started to use a little bit more, and then we've got the YouTube channel. That's London Paul, which is obviously a slightly different name, but we decided to set a new one up, and we've got the Facebook page, obviously the Sirius Report as well. And just thank you for all your support. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's our honor, Paul. So so everyone make sure to check out Paul's work. And then as far as Rogue Money, you can find us at roguemoney.net on Facebook, at the Rogue Money on Twitter. And again, Steemit. We are posting quite a bit to Steemit as well. So check that out. And that's just Rogue Money on Steemit, as well as our YouTube channel. Also want to thank our sponsor, myfreedomnow.us. So if you're in need of any type of credit repair, they are the people that can help you. So again, want to thank our sponsor, myfreedomnow.us. With that being said, everyone enjoy your day, and we are over and we are out. Take care.